"Give me the night to think," she said. "Take 2 if you need them." Caleb nodded once, as if a fair bargain had been struck, and something in the set of his shoulders eased, as though he'd expected refusal outright and was surprised to find the door still open. "Mrs. Pruitt will show you up. Breakfast's at 6, whether or not you've decided anything by then." That night, lying in a bed that smelled of cedar and lavender, Mercy heard, twice, the sound of Caleb Whitlock walking the length of his porch in the dark, rifle in hand, checking the treeline. She understood, listening to those slow, deliberate steps, that whatever else this man was, he was not a man who slept easy, and that the danger that had killed Thomas Reyes had not finished its business in this county. By the second walk of the porch, she had nearly decided. By the third, when she heard him murmur something low to a ranch hand who'd ridden in wet and urgent near midnight. Words she couldn't catch, only the tension in them. She understood that saying yes would mean stepping directly into whatever storm had already claimed one man's life. She said yes anyway, not for love, for the same reason she'd boarded a train in the first place, because a life spent flinching from risk was no life a woman like her could afford to want. The wedding was small, 3 days later, conducted by a circuit preacher in the front room under Mrs. Pruitt's watchful, approving eye, and Mercy wore the dress meant for a dead man's arms instead, because it was the only good dress she owned and because refusing to wear it felt like a second kind of waste. She did not expect, standing before the preacher, to feel her hand tremble in Caleb's, not from fear of the vow, but from the sudden, unwelcome recognition that some part of her wanted this to be real. She had no time to examine the feeling. For days into the marriage, the trouble that had been circling the county road straight up to the Circle W's front gate. It began with smoke. Mercy was hanging wash when she smelled it. Not wood smoke from the kitchen, but the acrid, resinous burn of a structure catching. She turned to see black curling up from the direction of the north pasture, where 20 of Caleb's best breeding stock grazed behind good fencing. "Fire!" she shouted, and did not wait for permission before running for the house, for the rifle she'd seen Caleb clean the night before, for anything that might be useful. Caleb was already mounting, face gone hard and flat in a way she hadn't seen since the platform. "Stay in the house. Bolt the doors. Like hell I will." The words surprised her as they left her mouth. She had never cursed in front of a man in her life, but 4 days of marriage had already taught her that Caleb Whitlock did not respect a woman who folded at the first sign of trouble, and she found, standing there with smoke rising black against the noon sky, that she did not respect that woman either. "Tell me what needs doing and I'll do it." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, and beneath it, something that looked almost like the beginning of pride. "Get the hands from the south fence. Tell them fire and rustlers both. Tell them to bring every gun on the place." She ran. Her boots ate the ground between the house and the south pasture faster than she'd known she could move. Skirts hiked in a way Mrs. Pruitt would have scolded, and she found the hands already turning at the smell of smoke, already reaching for saddles. By the time she'd led them back, the north pasture fence had been cut in 3 places, cattle scattering into the smoke haze distance, and 6 riders in dusters and kerchiefs were driving what stock they could toward a break in the hills, firing behind them to keep Caleb's men pinned. Mercy had never fired a rifle at a person in her life. She had fired at rabbits, at a rattler once behind the Ohio boarding house, at Kens lined on a fence rail by a father too drunk to notice his daughter had better aim than he did. When one of the riders wheeled his horse toward Caleb, who was reloading, exposed, his horse spooked sideways by a gunshot too close. Mercy did not think. She raised the rifle Caleb had pressed into her hands not an hour into their marriage, sighted down the barrel the way her father, for all his faults, had once shown her, and fired. The rider's hat flew from his head. He wheeled away, cursing, more startled than hit, but it was enough to break his aim, enough to give Caleb the half-second he needed to swing back into his saddle and return fire of his own. The raiders broke off as quickly as they'd come, thundering back toward the hills with what cattle they'd managed to cut loose, leaving behind a smoking line shack, a torn fence, and one masked rider slumped forward but still a horse, clutching a shoulder that Caleb's return shot had found. In the ringing silence after, Mercy realized her hands were shaking so hard she could barely lower the rifle. "You hit him," Caleb said, riding close, his voice rough with something that wasn't quite disbelief. You saved my life. I aimed for his hat, Mercy said honestly. I didn't know if I could aim for more. You didn't have to. He swung down from his horse, and for a moment, smoke-stained rifle still smoking faintly in his own hands. He simply looked at her, and Mercy understood that whatever bargain they had struck 4 nights ago, it had just been altered by something neither of them had planned for. It was the ranch foreman, riding in from the south line, who brought the second blow. Boss, you'll want to see this. Pinned to the smoking timber of the burned line shack, driven through with a Bowie knife, was a scrap of paper. Caleb pulled it free, read it once, and his face went the color of ash. Marry the Reyes girl and you're next. This was a warning. The next fire won't stop at cattle. Mercy felt the ground tilt beneath her. They know who I am. They knew Thomas was courting a mail-order bride before he ever met the marshal about the rustling. Caleb said grimly, "Word travels faster than trains out here. Someone's been watching this whole county long enough to know exactly which pressure points to strike." He crumpled the note in his fist, jaw working. "This isn't about cattle anymore, Mercy. This is about silencing anyone who stands against them. And they've decided you're part of that now. Because I married you. Because you didn't run." Something raw moved behind his eyes. Most women would have taken the morning ride back to town rather than say yes to a stranger's proposal with a killer still loose in the county. You stayed. And now you're a target because of it. Mercy looked down at the rifle still in her hands, at the smoke still rising black against the sky, at the burned shack and the torn fence and the blood. Not much, but some, staining the ground where the wounded rider had fled. "Then we'd best find out who's behind it," she said, "before they find a way to finish what that note started." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and whatever he saw in her face, steel where he might have expected only fear, seemed to settle something in him. "Come inside," he said quietly. "It's time I told you everything Thomas and I suspected, before this marriage put you square in the middle of it." That night, after Mrs. Pruitt had bandaged a graze on Caleb's forearm he hadn't mentioned taking, and after the hands had doubled the watch on every fence line, Caleb sat across from Mercy at the kitchen table with a hand-drawn map of the county spread between them like a confession. "Thomas and I had been comparing brand tallies for months," he said, tracing a finger along a ridge marked in faded pencil. "Small losses at first, a few head here, a few there, the kind of thing a rancher chalks up to wolves or strays. But the losses kept climbing, always from the smaller outfits, always driven toward the same stretch of badlands past Cutter's Ridge. We started to suspect someone was running a shadow operation, rebranding stolen stock and selling it 2 counties over, where nobody would recognize the marks. And you think whoever's behind it killed Thomas because he was close to proving it." "I know it." Caleb's jaw tightened. "The morning before he died, he sent word he'd found something. A bill of sale," he said, "tying the operation to someone with standing in this county. Someone nobody would suspect. He never got the chance to tell me who." Mercy studied the map, the pencil marks, the man across from her whose hands, scarred, steady even now, had spent the whole evening tending fences and watching roads instead of resting a wound he'd taken protecting people who weren't even his blood 2 weeks ago. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, "instead of keeping me sheltered from it the way most husbands would think it their duty to do?" Caleb was quiet a moment, turning his cup of coffee slowly between his hands. "Because I watched you put a rifle to your shoulder today and do what needed doing without waiting to be told twice. A woman like that deserves the truth of what she's married into, not a comfortable lie." He looked up, and something unguarded moved behind his eyes. "My wife, Anna, she used to say I kept too much locked away. That a man who won't share his fears with the person closest to him is a man alone even in a full house. I didn't understand what she meant until she was gone and I had 4 years of silence to sit in. You loved her very much." "I did. I do, in the way you love the dead. A love that doesn't ask anything of you anymore, only remembers." He reached into his coat and drew out a small carved wooden bird, worn smooth at the edges from handling. "She carved these, meadowlarks mostly. Said they were the only bird brave enough to sing through a Wyoming winter. I've one in every room of this house. Can't bring myself to put them away, and can't bring myself to look at them straight on most days." Mercy took the small carving carefully, turning it in the lamplight. The detail in it, the delicate feathering, the tilt of the small wooden head, spoke of hours of patient love poured into something that would outlast the hands that made it. "I have nothing so fine to offer in exchange," she said, "but I'll tell you the truth Thomas never got from me, since it seems only fair you should have it from someone." She set the bird down gently between them. "I told him in my letters that I was eager, that I looked forward to ranch life, that I'd make a good and biddable wife. None of that was entirely a lie, but none of it was entirely true either. The truth is I was terrified. I am 29 and I have never once in my life felt safe, and I thought perhaps a stranger's ring might buy me a version of safety that nothing else had. And now I've buried the man who offered it, married the man who might yet be killed for offering it a second time, and put a bullet close enough to a rustler's skull that half the county probably knows my name by morning." A small, unexpected laugh escaped her, edged with exhaustion rather than humor. "Safety, Mr. Whitlock, seems determined to elude me." "Caleb," he said, "if we're sharing truths, you might as well use my name." "Caleb, then." She said it carefully, testing the shape of it, and found she did not dislike how it sat in her mouth. He reached across the table, not taking her hand, only resting his own near enough that she could have closed the distance if she chose, and said low, "Scars mean it lived, Mercy. Whatever this county throws at us, whatever this marriage started as, I don't intend to let it end in another burying. Not yours. Not after today." Outside, the wind had settled, the smoke from the burned line shack long since carried off toward the hills, and for a moment the kitchen held nothing but lamplight and the small carved bird between them and the fragile, dangerous thing that neither of them had planned but both, perhaps, had begun to want. Then a horse came pounding up the drive at a gallop, and the moment shattered. "Boss!" The foreman's voice, hoarse with running. "Boss, you'd best come, they've hit the Hendricks place. Whole barn's gone, and old man Hendricks is asking for you by name. Says he knows who's been running the rustling. Says he saw the bill of sale himself before they burned his ledgers." Caleb was on his feet before the foreman finished, reaching for his gun belt, and Mercy rose with him, the wooden meadowlark still warm in her palm from where he'd left it in her keeping. "I'm coming with you," she said, and this time he didn't argue. Old man Hendricks was propped against what remained of his porch rail when they arrived, a wound in his side bound tight with a torn shirt, his barn a smoking black skeleton against the stars. He gripped Caleb's sleeve with a strength that belied his injury. "Prescott," he rasped. "It's Judge Prescott. I saw the bill of sale with my own eyes before his man put a torch to my ledgers. County judge running the whole operation, rebranding stock through his cousin's spread past Cutter's Ridge, using his bench to bury every complaint filed against the men doing his dirty work. Thomas Reyes found the same proof. That's why they killed him." Mercy felt the ground shift beneath the revelation. Judge Prescott, the very man who'd presided over land disputes, who'd shaken Caleb's hand at town meetings, who held the law of the entire county in his gavel, had been the shadow behind every burned barn, every stolen herd, every warning nailed to smoking timber. "He'll know we're onto him within the hour," Caleb said grimly, already calculating. "Man like that won't wait to be arrested by a marshal he doesn't control." "Then we don't give him the hour," Mercy said. They rode through the night, Caleb, Mercy, and 4 of the Circle W hands, toward Prescott's ranch house on the far side of the county. Not to storm it, Caleb was careful to say, but to reach the territorial marshal's deputy stationed nearby before Prescott could flee or destroy what remained of the evidence. Mercy rode astride rather than side saddle, skirts be damned, rifle across her lap, and found that fear, ridden through rather than around, had a way of turning into something closer to purpose. They found Prescott's men loading wagons in the dark. Ledgers, strongboxes, the physical proof of years of theft, preparing to run for the territorial line before dawn. What followed was not the standoff of dime novels, no dramatic draw in a dusty street, but something faster and uglier. A scramble of shouted warnings, a shot fired wide that spooked half the horses into bolting, and Caleb going hand to hand with Prescott's foreman in the mud beside an overturned wagon while Mercy, cold and clear-headed in a way she would marvel at for years afterward, leveled her rifle at the judge himself as he tried to slip toward a waiting horse. "Judge Prescott," she said, voice steadier than her heart, "you'll want to stand very still." He did not test her. Perhaps he'd heard, by then, about the hat she'd shot clean off a rustler's head 3 days prior. By the time the deputy marshal arrived with reinforcements, Prescott and 4 of his men were bound and disarmed, the wagons of stolen ledgers secured as evidence that would, in the weeks to come, see the judge stripped of his bench and sentenced to territorial prison for conspiracy, arson, and Thomas Reyes's murder. The small ranchers of the county, the ones who'd lost cattle to a shadow they couldn't name, held a town meeting that spring not to mourn but to celebrate, and named the new schoolhouse being built on donated land after the man whose stubborn digging had started the unraveling. The Reyes School, its cornerstone carved with a line Caleb insisted on personally. He looked when it was easier to look away. Mercy stood at that cornerstone dedication in autumn. A season past the wedding, she'd worn a dead man's intended dress with Caleb's hand resting easy at the small of her back. Not the careful, uncertain touch of 2 strangers bound by convenience, but something that had grown, slow and real, out of smoke and gunfire, and a small carved meadowlark passed between 2 grieving hands. "You never did tell me," Caleb said quietly, as the schoolhouse bell rang for the first time over the gathered crowd, "whether you regret staying that first night, when you could have taken the morning ride back to town instead." Mercy considered the county spread out below them, the mended fences, the rebuilt line shack, the ranchers who nodded to her now not as a stranger but as one of their own, and thought of the platform in Larkspur where she'd stood with a folded wedding dress and nowhere on earth to call hers. "I came out here to marry a stranger for the sake of safety," she said. "I got neither the stranger I expected nor the safety I asked for. I got something better, a husband who tells me the truth even when it's dangerous, and a home I had to fight for instead of one simply handed to me. I find I don't regret the trade." Caleb reached into his coat and pressed something small into her palm. Not the meadowlark she already kept on the windowsill of their bedroom, but a new one, freshly carved, its wings caught mid-flight rather than folded in mourning. "Anna taught me to carve those," he said. "For the birds brave enough to sing through winter. Seemed only right you should have one that's learned to fly." Years later, when their own daughter asked why the schoolhouse bore a stranger's name, Mercy would tell her about the groom who never came, and the rancher who offered something better than rescue. A bargain honestly struck, a truth honestly told, and a marriage that had started as survival and become, against every hard lesson life had taught her to expect, love. The last anyone in Larkspur remembered of that story was this. 2 names carved not on a grave, but on a schoolhouse beam still standing, and a wooden meadowlark on a windowsill, wings spread, facing east toward the sunrise. "He's not coming," the stationmaster said, not unkindly, as the last light drained out of the sky over Larkspur, Wyoming. Mercy Calloway stood on the platform with her carpetbag at her feet, and her wedding dress folded so carefully in tissue paper that it had survived 3 days on a train and still looked untouched by the world. Unlike her. She had read the man's letters until the ink wore thin under her thumb. "I will be there, Miss Calloway, waiting with my hat in my hand." His name was Thomas Reyes, and he had asked her to marry a stranger sight unseen. And she had said yes because the alternative was staying in a boarding house in Ohio where the walls smelled of other people's disappointment. Now the platform was empty except for a stray dog and a lantern swinging on its hook, ticking like a slow clock. "Sometimes they get cold feet," the stationmaster offered. He would not meet her eyes. "Sometimes," Mercy said, "they get shot." She said it flatly because 2 towns back a drifter had told her, almost as an afterthought while loading her trunk, that there'd been trouble out at the Reyes spread. Night riders, a burned line shack, a man missing since Tuesday. She had not let herself believe it until this moment. Standing on a platform with a dress meant for a man who might already be in the ground. That was when the buckboard rattled up out of the dark. And the man driving it did not look like rescue. He looked like trouble wearing a good coat. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had built their own barns, gray threading early through black hair, and there was a stillness to him that Mercy had learned, growing up around men who drank too much and struck too easily, to be wary of. Stillness could mean patience, could also mean a held breath before violence. "You'll be Miss Calloway," he said. "Not a question. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Caleb Whitlock." He set the brake and climbed down, boots striking the platform boards hard enough to make the lantern jump. "I own the Circle W west of town, and I knew Thomas Reyes." Knew. Past tense. Mercy felt the word land in her chest like a dropped stone. "Then you can tell me where he is." I can tell you where they buried what was left of him, Caleb said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat exhaustion of a man delivering news he'd delivered too many times before. 3 nights back. Whoever's been running cattle off the small outfits around here didn't care for him talking to the marshal about it. The dog at the platform's edge began to howl, low and long, as if it understood. Mercy did not cry. She had learned young that crying in front of strangers only taught them where to press. Instead she looked at her carpetbag, at her folded dress, at the ticket stub in her glove that said one way, and she understood with a cold, clean clarity that she had crossed half a country to marry a dead man and now had nowhere on this earth that was hers. I'm sorry for your loss, Caleb said. I know you didn't know him, but he spoke of you like, he stopped himself, jaw working. Like what? Like you were already a wife he was proud of. Caleb looked away, out toward the dark line of hills. He showed the boys at the mercantile your photograph. Said you had backbone. Something in Mercy's throat closed. She had sent that photograph to a man she had never met, hoping he would find something in her plain face worth the price of a ticket, and instead she had made herself known to a whole town of strangers as a dead man's intended. What happens to me now? She asked, and hated how small her voice sounded on the empty platform. Caleb was quiet a long moment. Behind him, thunderheads were building black and slow, moving over the western ridge, and the wind that came ahead of them smelled of rain and turned dust. There's a storm coming, he said, which was not an answer. You can't stand out here till it breaks. I have money for a room. Larkspur's boarding house burned in the spring. There's a room over the saloon if you fancy being kept up all night by drunk men singing off-key. Or, he hesitated, and for the first time something uncertain moved behind his eyes, a man weighing a thing he had not planned to say. Or there's the Circle W. I've a housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, respectable as a church pew, and more rooms than I know what to do with since my sister married and moved to Cheyenne. You're offering to take in a stranger. I'm offering to take in the woman Thomas Reyes was set to marry. On the night his death makes that impossible, because I don't much like the notion of leaving her to the mercy of a saloon and a storm. He said it plainly, no softness dressing it up, and somehow that plainness was more convincing than any gentleman's flourish would have been. You can say no. Thunder rolled distant over the hills, and the first fat drops began to strike the platform boards like coins dropped from a height. Mercy looked at the stranger, at his scarred knuckles, at the tired set of his mouth, at the way his eyes kept sliding toward the road behind him as though he expected trouble to come riding down it, and she made a choice that would follow her the rest of her days. All right, Mr. Whitlock, she said, picking up her carpetbag. Take me home. Neither of them said the word home meant anything yet. But the rain came down hard as they climbed onto the buckboard, and somewhere out past the hills, a rifle shot cracked once through the storm. Too far to reach them, too close to ignore. The Circle W sat low and long against the hillside, windows lit gold against the storm, and Mercy thought it looked like the kind of place a woman could learn to want, if wanting were a thing she still allowed herself. Mrs. Pruitt met them at the door with a lamp and a face that asked 100 questions and voiced none of them, only clucked at Mercy's rain-soaked dress and steered her toward a fire before Caleb had finished stabling the horses. It was full dark by the time he came in, shaking water from his hat, and found Mercy sitting stiff-backed in his front room like a guest who expected to be told to leave. You needn't sit like that, he said, like you're waiting for the roof to fall. I've learned to expect it might. He studied her a moment, not unkindly, but the way a man studies a horse he's not yet sure is broke or simply biding its time. Thomas told me you'd had a hard road. Didn't say how hard. He didn't know how hard. I told him what a woman tells a stranger she's hoping will marry her. The parts that make her sound worth the ticket. Mercy folded her hands in her lap, steadying them. My father drank. My mother died young enough that I don't remember her voice. I raised 2 brothers who are grown now and gone and don't write. I am 29, Mr. Whitlock, which in most towns makes me an old maid, and I came out here because a dead man's letters were kinder to me than anyone living had been in a decade. She had not meant to say so much. The words had simply come, the way water finds a crack in a dam once the first give is made. Caleb did not offer pity, which she was grateful for. Pity would have broken something in her that she needed intact tonight. Instead he sat across from her, elbows on his knees, and said, Then you understand why I'm not simply being a Christian about a stranded woman. Explain it to me anyway. 2 years back, my wife died of the fever that came through with the railroad crews. Left me this house too big and too quiet, and a ranch that needs more hands than I can hire honest, because half the men in this county are either running with the rustlers or too scared of them to work for a man who's spoken against them in town meeting. He said it evenly, a recitation worn smooth by repetition, though Mercy caught the flicker beneath it, old grief, still tender at the edges. Thomas Reyes was going to be my ally. Small outfit, but he had backbone, like I said, and he was fixing to organize the ranchers against the men stealing us blind. Now he's dead, and I am short one ally and looking, tonight, at a woman with nowhere to go. Mercy's spine straightened. If you mean to suggest I take his place at some meeting table, Mr. Whitlock, I know cattle no better than I know Greek. I'm not suggesting that. A muscle worked in his jaw. I'm asking you to marry me. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Rain lashed the windows. Mercy heard her own pulse in her ears. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious, and I know exactly how it sounds. Caleb rose and paced to the window, hands clasped behind his back. A man choosing his words with the same care he'd choose a fence line. Not for romance. I buried a wife I loved, and I've no wish to pretend at feelings I don't have yet, and I'd never insult you by claiming otherwise. But a woman alone on this frontier is prey, Miss Calloway, to men like the ones who killed Thomas, to gossip that'll follow you into any town you try to settle in, to 100 small cruelties I can't protect you from unless you've a name that closes doors those men would otherwise kick open. My name closes doors. And you, he turned to face her. You came out here already choosing to marry a man you'd never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. I'm only offering the same bargain Thomas did. Except I'm alive to keep it. It was, Mercy thought, the most honest proposal a woman could hope to receive, and somehow that honesty cut deeper than any flowery lie might have. And if I say no? Then Mrs. Pruitt will make up the blue room, and in the morning I'll drive you to whatever town you like, and you'll have lost nothing by having asked. He said it without pressure, without the wounded pride tone men so often used to punish a woman's hesitation. I'd rather you say no honestly than yes out of fear of the storm. Mercy looked at her hands, chapped from train travel, from a life spent working rather than being waited upon, and thought of the empty platform, the swinging lantern, the rifle shot cracking distant through the rain.